How's it going, everybody? We've got a good one here for you today. We're doing the brakes and rotors on my friend's 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee. Outside of doing oil changes, this is probably the most common repair most of you are going to need to do to your cars. So I'm going to go through the whole thing. We're doing the rear side today, but the process is basically the same regardless of what car you have or if you're doing the fronts or backs. So it's good to check the thickness of your pads from time to time, but the surefire way to know that you need to replace them is the screamers here that I'm pointing at. It's a little piece of metal that's on the brake pad itself. It'll start rubbing against the rotor and make a horrendous screaming noise. If you've ever heard really squeaky wheels when people are going down the road or from your own car, there's a good chance you might need to do your brake pads. So getting around to the back side of the rotor, there's usually a couple of bolts holding onto the caliper itself. There's one at the top and one at the bottom on this car, but most of the cars I've worked on have a pretty similar layout. So we're just going to loosen up those two bolts. Once we've got those loosened up, you can just spin them off. There'll usually be enough tension built up in the calipers and the pads to where it won't just fall off, but it's not a bad idea to hold a hand below the caliper just so it doesn't fall and put any tension on your brake line. Now, your brakes are one of the most important pieces of safety equipment on your car. You want to be confident when you hit your brake pedal that you're going to fully come to a stop. So it's important to check the pad thickness every now and again. And especially if you hear those screamers come on, it's time to replace them. Usually, if you take it to a shop, you're going to pay anywhere from $400 to $600 per axle. So it'd be both sides on either the front or rear side of the car. We're doing it ourselves here today, so usually you'll pay anywhere from around $150 to $300 for both brakes and rotors, depending on what kind of car you have. So now we've got the caliper off here. I'm going to do a little bit of a close-up here on the pads themselves, and you can see that there's just this tiny amount of material left, and that's why we were coming against that screamer that was scraping against the rotor. So we were definitely high time for replacing them. Once you get the caliper itself off, I usually like to use a couple of pieces of wood, but you can use a tire or anything else you can fit under that axle that you can just rest that caliper on so you're not putting any tension on your brake line. Even if you have stainless steel lines, it's good not to put any pressure on those since you don't want to spring a leak in your brake fluid, since that could cause complete brake failure if you do create damage and are unaware of it. Now, if you've never done this before, something you might be tempted to do is take that nut off the center. But you actually don't have to remove the whole wheel assembly to do this. On the Jeep Grand Cherokee here, there's just an O-ring that secures the rotor itself to the wheel hub. So I just got a little plastic pick in there, and I'm just going to peel out that O-ring, and then we should be able to break the rotor free with a rubber mallet, just tapping it pretty gently. Don't worry if you have a little bit of trouble getting these things off. Sometimes they can be really stuck in there. But now that we've got the O-ring off, we can just tap each side with the rubber mallet. You don't have to give it too much force here to do this, depending on how rusted it is on there. But you can see once it starts to have a little bit of give, you can just pull it right off. Now that we've got the old rotor off, it's as simple as slide the new one on. Once you do, make sure it's fully seated, or else like me, you're going to struggle for a couple minutes figuring out why it's not sticking on there. Always use a new O-ring if you can. You can use the old one in a pinch, but if you do, give it a test first. Make sure it still feels elastic. Down here in the south, it'll bake in the sun and it'll feel brittle as they get older. Or if you live up north in those salty roads, that'll do some damage to it over time as well. And this is the stopgap keeping your rotor on your wheel hub assembly itself. So always make sure whenever you're doing car work to use new O-rings if you can help it. Now that the new rotor's on, it's time to do the pads. This part can be a bit of a pain. Those calipers have really tight tolerances when you're putting your new brake pads in there. So usually the old ones will come out a little bit easier as they've worn down over time. But once you get the old pads out of the caliper, what you're going to need to do is compress the piston itself. The piston is that circular ring inside of that cylinder that you see between those two pins that we unscrewed on the caliper. So to compress the piston, I'm about to use a woodworking clamp that I got from Harbor Freight. You can use a clamp like this. They sell ones that are built for the exact purpose of compressing brake pistons, but you need to be able to put pressure on the top side as well as the piston inside of the brake caliper itself in order to get that piston pushed up. From using your brakes over time with those old pads, that piston's going to come out as there's less and less material. And since we're about to put new brake pads on there with a bunch of additional material, it's going to need that extra clearance in order for us to fit it back on the rotor, which is also going to be a bit thicker than the old rotor that we just took off. So putting on new brake pads can be a bit of a balancing act. It's really tight tolerances when you're fitting it in there. The side with the prongs is going to go inside of the piston side, whereas the ring that we just compressed. On this car, that side went in just a little bit easier than the ones on the bottom. But there's going to be little grooves, and you'll see they line up inside of the caliper on the brake pads themselves. So you just need to make sure those grooves line up and then fit those prongs inside of the cylinder. And then it should be able to go right in. Now on this Grand Cherokee, the opposite side brake pad was really tight to get pushed in. So don't worry if this happens to you. It's completely normal. You might just have to come at it from a couple of different angles, but have some patience. Once you get it fitted in initially, then you can use a pry tool or gently use something else to continue pushing it down to get it seated all the way to the bottom. Well, once you have it in, the hard part's over. So here, now that I got the lower brake pad fitted in, now I just took one of my pry bar tools and then gently against the metal itself and not the brake pad, I'm pushing in the grooves that go into each of the corners to get it to seat down into the bottom, so then it'll slide in nicely. Now this is one of the best jobs to learn on your car to do yourself. On average, on the low end, you're going to spend $500 to do the front, another $500 to do the rear at a shop, but you can do it yourself easily for half the price or less. And then you get the opportunity to choose the parts that you put in. Make sure you put in high quality brakes and rotors. You can get ceramic ones that aren't going to leave horrible brake dust on your wheels. And you don't need an awful large number of tools to do this job. You do need a nice socket set, some wrenches, especially on this car where some of those bolts are really tight to get to. Here I'm using a pry bar tool and then a rubber mallet to get the rotors off itself. And then I just had a clamp to compress the pistons itself, but you really don't need too much besides that. So once you've got all of that down, and now we've got our new pads in there, now I'm just going to slip a little bit of extra grease on the front and rear sides of the brake pads. The grease helps everything run smoothly. It helps your brakes be less noisy, especially if those parts are not pre-lubricated. And then once we have all of that done, it's just a matter of putting everything back together. Now, most cars, regardless if it's a truck, SUV, are going to have brake systems exactly like this. Drum brakes were common in older cars before 2000, but most of you with anywhere near relatively modern vehicles are going to have very similar brake setups to this. And as we're putting the finishing touches on here, I would ask if you guys enjoyed this video or learned something that you please like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you guys would like to see me work on in the future. We've got some new videos in the works here that are a little bit of a different format, so stay tuned, new stuff's coming. But I don't have any sponsors. I'm doing all of this for fun and just to hopefully help some of y'all out there. So show me some love. Would really appreciate it. And here's the point where since we compressed those pistons, we were able to slip the caliper right back onto the rotor itself. That part is going to be much more difficult if you don't compress the piston, if you're able to get the new brake pads in at all. But now it's just a matter of slipping on those caliper bolts back into the top and bottom on each side. Then I'm just tightening them by hand. Then I'm going to come in with a wrench to give it one final tighten, and then come in with the torque wrench to get it down to the torque spec. After that, that's basically all there is to it. Now, there is some debate on whether every time you do your brakes, whether you have to do the rotors and the brakes or just the pads themselves. It really depends how much material you have left on your rotors. This will differ by car. If you own a caliper set, then you can measure on the rotors themselves exactly how thick they are. Depending on how much material you have left, you may want to replace your rotors. Something else to check for, when you hit your brakes, if you feel any wobbliness or like your steering wheel shakes when you hit the brakes, there's a good chance that your rotors might be warped as well. So even if there is enough material, it's totally worth replacing in that scenario. And then something else I don't show here in the video, a really important process of putting in new brake pads is actually breaking them in, no pun intended. So basically what that entails is once you get these back on and you get back out on the road, what you're going to want to do is speed up to about 45 to 50 miles an hour, and you're going to want to slam on the brakes as hard as you can, come to a complete stop, and then repeat that process as quickly as you can over and over again, and do it 4 or 5 times. And then once you've done that, you've fully broken in your brake pads. If you don't do that, you can end up inadvertently warping your rotors, which completely negates the whole point of doing all of this. So whenever you do your brake pads, even if you get it done at a shop, if they don't break it in for you, which they may or may not always do that, always make sure to break in new brake pads, or else you're going to end up taking it back to the shop a lot sooner than you would have hoped to. So now with that whole spiel out of the way, now I'm just torquing down the top and rear caliper bolts. And then after that, we're basically done with this side. Now you can probably tell this is a little bit sped up, but all in all, it probably took me an hour and a half to do both sides of this car on the rear brakes. So it's not a super long job. It's not quite as quick and simple as an oil change, but it's definitely not among one of the harder things you can do. And you don't have to get under the car. Once you've got it jacked up and rested on jack stands, you don't have to get under the car. You're basically coming at it from the side. So super easy job to do, especially if you have the tools. And once you get the wheel back on, don't torque the wheels all the way down until you have the car rested back on the ground. I'm just going to tighten up the bolts snug with my impact wrench here, so then I don't have to tighten them all the way once the car is back on the ground. But now we've moved on to the other side here, and then we'll just speed through this side again so you can see a second example, but it'll basically be the exact same as the first side. Whenever it comes to doing car work, whenever you're doing something that's mirrored on the left and the right side, it's always a smart idea to do it one side at a time. So then if you ever get stuck and forget where something goes, you always have the other side to go back and reference to. And the other added benefit, once you do one side, for me at least, it's always twice as fast to do the other side, since it's fresh in your mind. You've just done the exact same thing. It's basically just rinsing and repeating the same process. Now, if you're not like me and love getting your hands dirty just for fun, it's totally okay to take your car to a shop to get your brakes done if you don't have the tools or know-how or somebody to help you. But hopefully this video helps you understand how some of these pieces work and what's actually happening when you're getting your brakes replaced. When you take it into a shop, definitely have them show you pictures if they're telling you that your pads are either worn down or if your rotors need to be replaced. Any good shop will be happy to actually show you what's going on there. Make sure that they're not replacing parts unnecessarily.